Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first lecture for the water-soluble vitamins. Today we're going to be doing part one of vitamin C. So usually when I'm teaching this in person, I kind of go over these questions with everyone just to gauge what people know about vitamin C, which is usually kind of quite a bit actually. So vitamin C is probably one of the most well-known vitamins. So what foods provide vitamin C? If you kind of just think quickly in your head, most people would say like citrus or like fruits and vegetables, and most people kind of know that. And then, what is the key role of vitamin C in the body? So, what is the main function of vitamin C? So, the answer to that is antioxidant. That's one of the main things people know. It also has like a role in immune response and that type of thing. But I'd say, kind of combating free radicals is the one that most people would say. And then when vitamin C is taken as a supplement, what are people trying to fight against, or what diseases do they think it will prevent? So think kind of what I do actually when I was teaching, or when I started teaching this class, is I'd go to Walgreens or like Target Pharmacy and kind of just go into those sections, and maybe, I'd probably recommend that you do that once or twice while you're taking this class. And you can kind of just see what each of these vitamins and minerals are marketed for, because you can definitely buy the vitamins and minerals in like just a straight up, bottle of vitamin C, but a lot of times they're marketed as like whatever it is. And for vitamin C, you probably know it's like the main one is to combat colds, so to treat and prevent colds. And then there's also, it says that, some companies say that it can work for fighting cancer or cataracts, that type of thing. So in this class, basically the second lecture for vitamin C, we'll be going over all the science behind whether or not vitamin C can actually be used to fight colds and cancer and all that stuff. This first lecture is mainly kind of the background, function, food sources, that type of thing. But first, just to start you with a little bit of history. So I'm sure all of you have heard of scurvy and how vitamin C is tied into that. But just in case anyone hasn't, scurvy was very, very prominent in the late 1700s, particularly in sailors that were on long voyages, crossing seas, that type of thing. So when they were on boats for like 2 to 3 months at a time, or even up to a year. And fruits and vegetables obviously decompose and rot pretty quickly, so those were not present on boats. So in general, they were eating like salted meats, that type of thing, kind of like stale bread. That's the stuff that they would bring on the boats. And what they started to notice was that when they were on these boats for a very long time, so 5+ months, that these sailors would start to develop these spongy gums. So gums that would kind of turn black. Then their teeth would get really loose and kind of fall out. They'd also get these kind of bruises. This is very typical of scurvy. So not only the kind of tooth thing that you probably heard about, but you get this kind of dermatitis as well. And then in the 1800s, so I guess like a couple decades later, they found that if they sent citrus, so specifically limes, because limes can be stored, not forever, but they don't decompose as quickly as like an apple or something like that. When they sent those out on these long voyages, and when sailors would eat them, that they wouldn't develop scurvy, that their teeth would kind of stay in their mouths, everything would stay intact, and they wouldn't get any of these issues. And that's also why they call sailors limeys, just because I guess they used to eat a lot of limes. So scurvy today, we don't really see it that much, honestly, in the US. So you may see it in your clinical practice in babies, and that generally occurs in babies that are fed cow's milk. So for those of you that are mothers or have taken the nutrition and life cycle class already, definitely don't feed any infant under a year anything but breast milk or formula. You don't want to feed them cow's milk because it's deficient in a lot of nutrients, particularly vitamin C, because the vitamin C is destroyed with pasteurization. So yeah, you may see it in babies if you work kind of in pediatric populations. So humans can't synthesize vitamin C. Basically, all the stuff that all of the vitamins and minerals, or all the vitamins, I should say, that are essential, is basically just because we can't make them. The interesting thing with vitamin C, though, is that this is kind of the chain of how it's made. These are all the different compounds and the whole process of making vitamin C, also called L-ascorbate. And it actually starts with glucose. So we definitely have lots of glucose available to us. And we can kind of do this process in our bodies all the way up to here. Unfortunately, humans don't have this enzyme, galonolactone oxidase. And because we can't do this one step, basically converting this to this, that's why we can't make ascorbate or vitamin C. Just to point out, though, most mammals do have this. So cats and dogs, vitamin C is not essential for them because they do have this enzyme. But yeah, that's basically why vitamin C is essential to us. So food sources of vitamin C, as you probably guessed it, citrus is a really big food source. I'd say it's definitely the key food source. But one thing, so you will notice, obviously we just started this class, but I'm going to go through basically a very similar pattern of information for every different nutrient that we go through. So we're always going to start with like structure and then go to food sources and then functions, deficiency, toxicity, and then, always look at the top two excuse me, of your slides for kind of like what we're doing, but we'll always go through it in the same pattern. And then the thing I always mention too when we get to the food source slide is what the actual RDA or AI for the nutrient is. And if you just want to write it down here. So for vitamin C, for women, it's 75 milligrams per day. And then for men, it's 90 milligrams per day. And that information is really important when you're looking at the different food sources and serving sizes. So one thing that may become apparent to you now that you know it's 75 to 90 is just 1 cup of orange juice has 124. So way beyond, almost like 150% of like what we need in terms of vitamin C. So people, I don't know why it is, but people are just obsessed with vitamin C. They're taking in, I think there's this thing where people think you need like 10 fruits and vegetables to get the amount of vitamin C you need, or you should be drinking like 5 cups of orange juice. But that's not true at all. Just 1 cup of orange juice will get you all the vitamin C you need for the day. So you don't need to go crazy. Obviously it's important to eat like lots of fruits and vegetables. I'm not saying don't do that, but you can get your vitamin C needs pretty quickly just from, even 1 serving of green peppers, broccoli, or maybe 2 servings of like cauliflower, cantaloupe, that type of thing. So yeah, it's found in lots of fruits and vegetables, high doses in citrus, but just 1 to 2 servings of most fruits and vegetables will get you all you need for vitamin C for the day. I also try to go over like what cooking does to the different nutrients. This information is kind of hard to find, like actually scientifically accurate stuff. Interestingly, I can barely find anything about microwaving, so I haven't been able to include that in a lot of these slides. I don't know if it's like the microwave companies like keep that, don't want to publish that stuff, but I do try to talk about general cooking and what that does to each nutrient, because I found just historically, people have been interested in that. So what does cooking do to vitamin C in general? Boiling water. So if you're boiling like vegetables or fruits, I guess if you're into that, that doesn't really destroy vitamin C. So that's about 100 degrees Celsius. However, vitamin C will decompose. So that structure of vitamin C I showed you, basically that carbon chain, will start to disintegrate and kind of fall apart at over 190 degrees Celsius. And the type of cooking that's 190 degrees and over is like pressure cooking, any kind of like long time, like roasting, frying for sure in oil, or grilling, like any kind of barbecue situation where you're like holding a piece of food over a fire, I guess it's not that shocking that that's going to start to destroy some of these organic compounds. Vitamin C can also leach into cooking water. That's one of the things that, you'll notice with a lot of these water-soluble vitamins, you need to have like pretty high temperatures to destroy them. But the main way that we actually lose them is when we're boiling vegetables. So we're not destroying the vitamin C itself, but say if you're boiling like potatoes or something like that, most of the vitamin C will actually leave the food and then just enter the cooking water. So if you want to, make sure you're getting some of that vitamin C, I would advise like using the cooking water, making some type of soup or what have you. So again, when you're boiling it, the vitamin C is not destroyed, but it does leach into cooking water. So in order to recoup that vitamin C, you definitely want to try to incorporate some of that cooking water in whatever you're making. In terms of cookware, copper cookware can catalyze the decomposition of vitamin C. So I generally wouldn't recommend copper cookware. You can get a bit of copper from it, but in general it kind of, doesn't work for vitamin C, and then it can also interfere with the absorption of other minerals, which we'll talk about in the mineral section. I had some previous questions about refrigeration, and in general the only thing I could find was that fresh cut fruits, so if you like cut up an orange, that doesn't really lose vitamin C very quickly if you put it in the fridge. So it will probably remain stable for a few days if you cut up an orange in the fridge. But in general, after that, there has been a little bit of disintegration has been shown to occur. When we look at vitamin C in supplements, again, just looking at what I could find at like Target or Walgreens, there's 4 major types of vitamin C. Free ascorbate, calcium ascorbate, sodium ascorbate, and ascorbyl palmitate. One thing, just quickly before I forget, for those, well, hopefully all of you have taken some type of biochem or organic chemistry, but I get these questions when I'm teaching this in person. So just remember the ic acid, this is straight up organic chemistry, is the same as the ate. So ascorbic acid and ascorbate are just 2 different ways of saying the exact same thing. So the ate just replaces the ic acid, and you'll see that for all these different things. So those are interchangeable, just in case anyone's confused. So yeah, there's 4 types. I haven't found any data to show that one is better absorbed. When we go into like the other vitamins and minerals, I'll kind of point out the ones that are either more economical or the ones that are like better absorbed. But for vitamin C, you can kind of get any one of these and they all seem equally as effective. If you're looking at, just to point out, usually you're getting 500 milligrams. So take a second and remember, how much do we need every day? 75 to 90. So, we're getting at least 5 times the amount that we need in just one of these pills. Not quite sure why they're doing that. We'll definitely talk about that a little bit in this lecture at the end, just in terms of like how much you actually need and how much your body can absorb. But yeah, pretty much I always see it as 500 milligrams on these bottles. Rosehip is one of the main places that we get vitamin C from, that we put into these supplements. So fruit of the rosehip plant, that contains a really high amount of vitamin C. So about 1,700 to 2,000 milligrams for 100 grams of the dried product. And so, yeah, that's kind of like, I guess, ground down or something like that, and it's used in these supplements. So the next thing I want to talk about is basically once you get the vitamin C from the food source, what does your body do to it to kind of get it in your bloodstream and into the tissues? So we always go through these slides as well. I would talk about digestion, and remember, digestion is the process of, well, in terms of the nutrients, it's basically when you want to cut off, like when you have vitamin C or I should say like any other vitamin, a lot of times that vitamin will be attached to a fat or a carb. And then you need to literally just cut that fat or carb or food component off the nutrient to kind of get it into the form where you can absorb it. In the case of vitamin C, it just comes as straight up ascorbate. So there's no carbs or fats or proteins attached to it, no other food components. So that's why I'm saying there's no digestion required, because you don't need to cut any of those food components off of it. In terms of absorption, so where we actually bring it into the body, most of that occurs in the ileum. So now just to point out here, for ascorbate, so this is a series of slides that kind of confuses people, and I'll show you why in a second. But for straight up vitamin C that we just got from our foods, ascorbate or ascorbic acid, same thing, there's two different ways that we can absorb it. First, if you're just taking in like a low to normal amount, so kind of like the amount you take in with like a fruit or vegetable or a glass of orange juice, your body will use a sodium-dependent transporter, specifically SVCT. So down here, that's sodium-dependent vitamin C transporter. And it uses that to get it into the enterocyte. Then it travels through the blood, and then it uses SVCT2 to get into the tissues. And then in terms of consuming high amounts of vitamin C, so I guess the amount that you'd get with a supplement, remember supplements you're getting like 500 milligrams, you're actually just going to use simple diffusion for that. So this is kind of an important thing. I want to point this out because this is a very similar pattern that you're going to see across pretty much all of, or I'd say most of the water-soluble vitamins. When you have a low to normal amount of whatever water-soluble vitamin coming into your body will expend resources or energy, so use some type of energy-dependent process to bring it into your body. Because basically your body's like, oh, we're not getting a lot of this. Well, I'm going to expend resources to make sure we get enough today. Whereas if you're having really high amounts, if you're one of those people that's always consuming those emergencies or supplements constantly throughout the day, then your body will say like, whoa, we've got like a lot of this coming in. I'm not going to expend any energy on this. I'm just going to let it come in through simple diffusion because like, you know, it is what it is. Let's just see how much comes in anyway because we have enough. So just remember low to normal intakes, energy-dependent process, simple diffusion for high intakes. So this is kind of what I was alluding to before. This is where it gets a little complicated. So this is ascorbate, so straight up vitamin C. Sometimes vitamin C will interact with food components in the gut lumen. And if you remember, vitamin C is, or as you probably know, a potent antioxidant. So an antioxidant is basically anything that gives up electrons pretty readily. So vitamin C will give up its electrons sometimes to other kind of free radicals in the gut lumen. So in the process, like while it's getting absorbed. And when it's kind of used up, or when it's given away its electrons, the used up form of vitamin C is called dehydroascorbic acid, or dehydroascorbate. Same thing. So this is vitamin C, ascorbic acid, and this is the used up form of vitamin C, dehydroascorbic acid. The only difference is that this is when it gave up its electrons. So it's the main function of vitamin C, you'll note, is that it's just this kind of like universal electron donor. That's basically all it does in the body. It doesn't do any super fancy things. It literally just gives up electrons. That's the main function of it. In every function that we look at, there's going to be a lot listed, but all it's doing every single time is giving up electrons. So what I want you to pay attention to now is that the used up form of vitamin C after it's donated its electrons is called this, dehydroascorbic acid. So when vitamin C in the gut lumen accidentally gives up its electrons, it becomes dehydroascorbate. But the body knows that it can recycle this back into normal vitamin C. So it decides to take it in. And it has two different mechanisms to take in that used up form of vitamin C. One is the GLUT4, so sodium dependent transporter, or sorry, GLUT1. And that's also used at the level of the tissues. And then the other way that it can take it in is just by kind of simple facilitated diffusion. And that's just facilitated by certain transport proteins that are sodium independent carriers. And then right after it enters the blood, so once you have the used up form of vitamin C gets into the enterocytes, kind of put out into the blood, the body will then take this used up form and recycle it back into the active form of vitamin C. So dehydroascorbates rapidly reduce back to ascorbate, and what does this is glutathione. So glutathione kind of spares vitamin C and improves the antioxidant capacity of the blood. So I just want to backtrack because whenever I teach this in person, people get confused. So look at the top of your slide. This is absorption for straight up vitamin C ascorbate. There we go. And then I have it indicated that these are the mechanisms for dehydroascorbate, the used up form. So the body again will take in the used up form because it knows that once it's in the blood, it can take up the used up form and just convert it into just straight up normal vitamin C. Just to remind you too, we do have every Friday I have a live session to answer questions. So please, if any of this confuses you, just tune in Fridays at noon, and the link to the Zoom meeting is on Blackboard. So anything, please, please just let me know then. I'd also ask that you don't email me with like really complicated questions. That stuff, doing all that, like explaining that stuff over email usually just confuses people more. So it's easier to do, when I'm teaching this in person, I always ask people just come up to me after class, because that way I can work with you throughout the slides, and I'll happily do that at those live Q&A sessions. We can pull up the slides and kind of go through whatever you find confusing. So the other thing I really want to talk about, and this is a very important thing to learn from this class, is that just because you take in more of a certain nutrient doesn't mean that you're going to be absorbing all of that. So if you notice here at just like low intakes of vitamin C, your body's bringing in most of it. At kind of usual intakes that you'd see with just regular fruit and vegetable consumption, you're again taking in a fair amount of that. But if you're taking in tons and tons of stuff, it actually drops considerably. And I'll show you kind of specifically what happens in the blood in a couple slides. Absorption can also decrease with really high intakes of glucose. And if you are taking in tons of supplements per day, which I would definitely not recommend, most of the time, you can just get it from your food sources. You do not need to take supplements of vitamin C. It would be basically what happens is those actual capsules or tablets, whatever you're taking in, just kind of end up staying in your gut lumen. And then what happens is bacteria end up acting on those capsules and giving you like gas and diarrhea and stuff like that. So that's one of the toxicity effects of when you're taking in too many kind of tablets of vitamin C. In terms of transport, vitamin C isn't attached to anything when it travels from the intestine to the tissues. It enters the plasma by way of the capillaries, or capillaries, I should say. In Canada, we say capillaries. But people make fun of me for that. And then when it's in transport again, it's in free form. So with other nutrients, sometimes it's attached to albumin, or, in the case of fat-soluble vitamins, it's attached to like cholesterol basically. But vitamin C completely travels in free form. And then it enters various tissues, as I showed you on those absorption slides, by different sodium-dependent transporters. So storage of vitamin C, definitely stored kind of throughout the body because it has that essential role of being an antioxidant. So that's a function that's used in basically almost all the tissues of the body. But we do find kind of super high amounts in the adrenals and the pituitary, kind of moderate amounts in liver, heart, kidney, lungs, that type of thing, and kind of smaller amounts in the red cells and then in the muscle. So why do you think the concentration of vitamin C in the adrenal glands is so high? Does anyone know why that is? Maybe you learned it in physiology class. Well, to tell you what the answer is, it's because vitamin C helps in the synthesis of stress hormones, which we're going to see in a second, specifically norepinephrine. So this is, I'd say, one of the most important slides I'm going to show you, maybe even in the whole class. Because I find a lot of people come into this class, or maybe even like enter nutrition thinking, like as a discipline, thinking that supplementation is like super important and we need to be taking all these extra supplements, kind of like Kelly Ripa advocates or whatever. But we don't. Basically, if you're a healthy individual, for the most part, you can get everything you need from your food, even if you're just eating like 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And then, yeah, that's basically all you need, and you'll get pretty much everything. You don't need to be investing or spending all this money on different supplements. And let me just show you why. So to explain this graph a bit, down here, this is the dose per day of vitamin C. So this here is when you're taking in, remember we need 75 to 90. So you're taking 75 to 90 in here. This is 500 milligrams, so the amount that you're going to get from one of those supplements, 1,000, 2,500, etc. just rises. And this is how much is entering the blood. So depending on how much you're taking, how quickly it kind of enters the blood. So you'll notice at lower amounts, so from 30 to 180 milligrams per day, that you're getting this really steep increase. So basically, if you're consuming small amounts of vitamin C, your body's taking in almost all of it. It's just kind of getting shuttled right through the enterocyte, and your body's kind of just like sucking it all in, basically. But then as you start to consume higher amounts, so once you kind of reach this plateau level of 200 milligrams per day, which again is basically just like 2 to 3 servings of fruits or vegetables or juices, all of a sudden your body just kind of stops taking it in, or the absorption rate slows down considerably. And then with higher amounts, it almost basically plateaus. So all this is to say is higher amounts don't result in higher plasma levels, like higher intakes. So you can't, there's this weird thing where most of the general public thinks like, oh, vitamin C is really good for me. I need a lot of that. So I'm going to like super, I don't know what a good word for it is, but just I'm going to like invigorate my body and I want to have a ton of vitamin C in my body. But that's impossible. Your body has very specific rules about like how much it takes in. So your body can't take in tons of vitamin C, one, because it would greatly disrupt the pH of your blood. I know there's some weird diet books out there saying that you should like, disrupt the pH of your blood, but that is completely impossible. Your blood will maintain at, I believe it's 7.35 to 7.4 or something. It's got a very small pH range because, if that's disrupted, then a bunch of your enzymes won't work anymore. So you can't decide to take in a whole bunch of whatever nutrient you think is important and think that your body's going to store it all for later use. It's not. It's just going to not take it in. So basically what happens with most of that stuff is that it just stays in your gut lumen and ends up giving you like indigestion. So please don't take in crazy high amounts, as you'll kind of learn in the next lecture. Well, I don't want to give away too much, but vitamin C doesn't actually really work well for like cold prevention in most people. All that emergency stuff that are giving, I actually don't even know what the amounts in that. I think it might be like 2,000 or something milligrams per day. It's kind of just ludicrous, honestly. Your body is not using that. It's basically just kind of a marketing scheme that it isn't scientifically proven to work at all. All right, so on to functions of vitamin C. Some of the main functions are hydroxylation reactions, and I'll explain what that is just in case you forgot. And that's really kind of how vitamin C in this kind of offhanded way helps build things like collagen and carnitine. It's also obviously the next major function is as an antioxidant, so reducing free radicals. And then it can actually also act as a pro-oxidant, which kind of confuses people, but we'll talk about that as well. The next lecture, so the part 2 lecture, will be for when we discuss kind of whether or not those supplements, vitamin C supplements, work for colds or cancer, cataracts, that type of thing. So kind of like all the stuff that it's marketed for. So first of all, talking about our first hydroxylation reaction, and that would be regarding the effects of vitamin C in collagen synthesis. So a bit of background on collagen. Remember, it is the main protein of connective tissue. So it's kind of like this lattice, this lattice that happens here. Whenever I teach this in person, I kind of like put my fingers together in this lattice formation to show people. Fortunately, I can't do that here, but you kind of see what I'm talking about here. It just kind of crisscrosses. And then it's found in skin, tendons, cartilage, bone, dentin, that type of thing. So it kind of gives that kind of like turgid appearance to skin. When you're young, you have a lot more of it. And then as you get older, you have less cartilage, or sorry, less collagen. And then that's kind of why skin gets a little droopy. Basically, that lattice kind of gets a little weaker, and there's basically less collagen fibers. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the body, and it accounts for about 25% of body protein content. So the structure of collagen, which you may have learned in either like physiology or anatomy classes, it's basically made of 3 polypeptide chains. So remember, polypeptide, as you reviewed in Song's class, is just a chain of amino acids. And basically here are the 3 polypeptide chains. So it's just shown to you in blue, red, and green. And then what happens is these 3 polypeptide chains kind of coil together. And then what needs to happen to solidify that one kind of collagen strand, I guess you could say, is that you need to have these cross links that form between the chains to kind of make sure that this thing doesn't fall apart pretty much. So what does vitamin C do in this? Some people find it a little confusing because it's actually not that straightforward, as you'll see in a second. It participates in a hydroxylation reaction on the polypeptide chain that prepares the chain for cross-linking. So here's those cross-linking, solidifying bridges I was talking about. Vitamin C does not link these things, just to point that out. It does something a bit more underhanded, I'd say. So let me show you the whole process. So first of all, remember that a hydroxylation reaction is simply a reaction where you're replacing a hydrogen with a hydroxyl, or also called an OH group. Some people say that. So in the case of basically what it's doing here is that it takes this proline, so one of the amino acids in that chain, and proline already has this hydrogen, and then what it does is a hydroxylation would simply replace the hydrogen with a hydroxyl group here. So the only thing that's changed here is this hydrogen has now been replaced by this hydroxyl group. And then when that happens, instead of being called proline now, it's called hydroxyproline. And just to kind of backtrack here, so basically let's say this is the proline. So what we're doing is you have a little hydrogen sticking out here. We're replacing that with a hydroxyl group or an OH group. And then that will basically help it prepare to get bonded to another proline. So this is done, this hydroxylation reaction is done by prolyl hydroxylase. That's the enzyme that kind of does this replacing. And prolyl hydroxylase needs iron as a cofactor to do this whole thing. So it kind of just uses up iron. You can kind of see it like that. It uses up the electrons from iron in order to basically do this conversion from proline to hydroxyproline, or basically replace this hydrogen with a hydroxyproline. Prolyl hydroxylase will kind of use iron as a cofactor. And then when that happens, obviously when iron gives up its electrons, it goes from the 2+ form to the 3+ form, or you can also say the ferrous form to the ferric form. And we haven't even talked about vitamin C yet. So at this stage, you're probably like, wait, so why is this, how does this involve vitamin C? So what does vitamin C do in this whole reaction? Vitamin C, not surprisingly, acts as a reducing agent to convert iron back to the reduced state. So remember, a reducing agent is something that gives up electrons, so antioxidant, and this allows iron to participate in future reactions. So all vitamin C is doing, remember, its main function in the body is just to donate electrons. Every time we see it do anything, it's donating electrons. So in this case, what is it doing to iron? it's donating electrons, so not surprisingly. And then when ascorbate, vitamin C, donates those electrons, it then gets used up, turns into the used up form, dehydroascorbate. And then, yeah, glutathione can recycle that eventually. But basically all it's doing is helping to recycle iron, so then prolyl hydroxylase can use it again, somewhere else down the line. And then this kind of all ties back into what we're talking about with scurvy. So the reason that people develop scurvy kind of more on a molecular level is because they couldn't make enough collagen. And the reason they couldn't make enough collagen is because they weren't getting enough citrus or fruits and vegetables on these long voyages. If they didn't have enough vitamin C, it couldn't participate in, regenerating iron and then basically helping to make collagen. So they basically didn't have enough collagen in their gums, and then their gums became kind of like loose. They weren't turgid anymore, and then that's why they were losing their teeth. So the second hydroxylation reaction that we had listed there is carnitine synthesis, and you'll start to notice a pattern here. But before we get into that, I want to remind you what carnitine is. I'm sure you learned it in Dr. Song's class last semester. Remember that it's a compound that's critical in fat metabolism. So it transports long-chain fatty acids from the cytosol to the mitochondria. And then it is oxidized in the mitochondria. Then fat is oxidized in the mitochondria. So basically it just helps in fat metabolism. So carnitine is made also by a hydroxylation reaction. So basically I'm showing it's made from this compound here, and then we're making carnitine. This is kind of the end product here. And the enzyme that helps to make carnitine is called 4-butyrobetaine hydroxylase. So that's the enzyme here. So again, it's a hydroxylation reaction. You have this compound here, has a hydrogen group. All we need to do is add a OH group on, a hydroxyl group. What's doing that is the enzyme 4-butyrobetaine. And then this enzyme uses iron as a cofactor to do this. And then guess what? The role of vitamin C is just to recycle that iron, to give iron back some electrons so iron can then participate in that reaction again. So very similar to what we saw with collagen. So yeah, the whole point of basically, I don't know, you can almost see like vitamin C as being this like universal recycler. It so readily gives up its electrons that it helps to like recycle all these cofactors and other things around the body. And then it's also used, there's a hydroxylation reaction is also used to synthesize tyrosine. So this is an enzyme, the enzyme that's involved in this is phenylalanine monooxygenase. So here's phenylalanine, it has its hydrogen group, and then in order to make it to tyrosine, or to turn into tyrosine, all you're doing to phenylalanine is replacing that hydrogen group with the hydroxyl compound. And then, yep, phenylalanine monooxygenase does that. Same pattern, iron is used as a cofactor in this process. And then here we go, same thing where vitamin C is just donating electrons to iron to help regenerate it. And then once, remember, this is super important, when vitamin C gives up its electrons, it then turns into the used up form of vitamin C, which is called dehydroascorbate. So the question is, can we recycle this back to vitamin C? Do you remember that from any slides? Yes, you can. You can make that back into usable vitamin C. So what actually converts that back? Glutathione. So glutathione helps convert dehydroascorbate back into usable ascorbate. So yeah, just to kind of summarize, basically to make carnitine, tyrosine, and collagen, you need that hydroxylation reaction where you're just replacing a hydrogen with a hydroxyl group. Iron is the cofactor used by all the enzymes that are doing that process. And then vitamin C is used to just simply recycle or make iron reusable again. So very similar pattern throughout each of these. It's also used, kind of the last hydroxylation reaction I want to talk about is norepinephrine. So vitamin C is used to make norepinephrine. This is kind of what we're talking about when we mention the adrenal glands. There's really high amounts of vitamin C in the adrenals because it's very important in helping to make norepinephrine. So remember, this is a stress hormone that's involved in fight or flight. It acts on the brain to increase heart rate, blood flow to the muscle. It also helps release glucose from energy stores, and it's synthesized from dopamine. So looking at this hydroxylation reaction, basically here you have dopamine with the same thing. You have your hydrogen. In order to make it into norepinephrine, the only thing you're really doing is changing that into a hydroxyl group. The enzyme that does this is dopamine monooxygenase. So basically the side chain of dopamine is hydroxylated to make norepinephrine by dopamine monooxygenase. And the only kind of difference here is that instead of using iron as a cofactor, it uses copper instead. But basically, the role of vitamin C is exactly the same. Vitamin C is just helping to recycle the copper, donate electrons to the copper, so it can then be used again to help basically make more norepinephrine down the line. So I hope that makes sense. So yeah, there it is. Hydroxylation reactions, collagen, carnitine, tyrosine, and that neurotransmitter norepinephrine. So that's kind of vitamin C's kind of building or synthesizing roles. And then the next major one is the antioxidant role of vitamin C. So a lot of this will probably just be like review of even like high school biology, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So vitamin C is an antioxidant, obviously. And remember, an antioxidant just means any kind of compound that readily gives up electrons. It's also another word for it is a reducing agent. And then another thing that you could also say is that vitamin C can reverse oxidation. So a reducing agent is something that reverses oxidation. So remember, a free radical is any compound that has an unpaired electron. So remember, you need 2 electrons here. When they're paired, the compound is stable, it's fine. But the second that it has an unpaired electron, that electron can be damaging to other cells or components. So what that free radical wants to do, since it wants to pair up this electron with another one, is it will go to DNA or cell membranes and it will just steal an electron from those compounds and basically cause damage to those, and then basically then be fine. It then will become stable because it will have 2 electrons. But then DNA can become damaged, which, down the line can lead to mutations and possibly even cancer. And then cell membranes, that can be destroyed, and cells can actually, if it has a lot of free radical damage, the cell can actually even like burst open. So, it can definitely be, tons of free radicals can be very damaging. So what vitamin C does is it kind of just comes along and prevents this whole process from happening by donating that electron. So now the free radical has paired electrons, and then it just won't need to go and steal stuff from other people, basically, or other things, I should say. But that's, simply that's all it does. But again, I know most of you probably started learning this when you were like 16 or something, so it's probably been drilled into your head already. But just in case anyone's confused, that's basically all what free radicals do. So free radicals, just a slide to kind of talk a little bit about where we get them. There definitely are some foods that may have kind of, it's so that fast foods, or even like if you have like plastics in foods, that may result in more free radical formation. But I'd say the main sources for us are really like smoking and alcohol. Those definitely generate a lot of free radicals in our body. So examples of common free radicals are the hydroxyl radical. So this one right here, you've probably seen that before. That's an extremely reactive oxygen species. And then there's also the superoxide radical, which is an oxygen-centered radical. So examples of reactions involving kind of vitamin C as an antioxidant. So what does it do to these two kind of highly reactive free radicals? So here's vitamin C, ascorbate. When it interacts with the hydroxyl radical, basically what happens is that free radical becomes semi-dehydroascorbate plus water. So two things that are basically inert that cannot harm the body. And then when it reacts with the second one, the superoxide radical, it then becomes, the products are dehydroascorbate plus hydrogen peroxide. So basically two things that are not that damaging. Hydrogen peroxide, I know it sounds a little scary, but there's tons of body processes that just produce that as a byproduct, and then your body usually eventually just kind of gets rid of that by turning it into water. So what happens to vitamin C after it gives its electron away? The question here really, again, since it's so important, I know I'm kind of harping on this, but here's vitamin C you get from food. Usable vitamin C has all its electrons still, turns into the used up form, dehydroascorbate, so kind of what we first talked about in the absorption slides. When it's in this form, can you recycle it back? Yes, you can. What does that? Glutathione. I really want you to remember that from this lecture. Ascorbate, what we get from food, usable vitamin C, dehydroascorbate, used up vitamin C. This is the form where it gave its electrons away. In order to get it back, the body can recycle it back. It needs vitamin C. It will recycle it back, and it does this by the action of glutathione. This is also kind of plays into the reason why we don't need tons of vitamin C constantly coming in. Like, we need a little bit from our diets, but we don't need tons of it because our body just recycles a lot of the stuff that we already have. I have had questions about how many times can it be recycled, and I honestly was not able to find that answer. I don't know if it, can it be recycled a certain amount of times and then it starts to disintegrate? I wasn't able to find any good publications behind that, but it is a great question. Other than that, let's see what else. Oh, in the body, glutathione, also I wanted to point out, is almost always found in its reduced form. And that's because the enzyme that reverts glutathione, or kind of recycles glutathione itself, is always active. And then, so what do you think helps reduce glutathione? Maybe some of you know this from physiology. It's actually pretty straightforward. What helps reduce glutathione is just glutathione reductase. So all of this is just this kind of like cyclical recycling pathway. So glutathione gets electrons given back to it by glutathione reductase. It then passes it on to vitamin C, and then vitamin C does that to iron or copper or whatever, or a free radical. So it's this kind of just like everybody, it's like this electron donation pathway where, if I'm teaching this in person, which I pretty much always have, is, you're just kind of passing electrons down the line, basically. That's all that's happening. All right, so thank you so much. I have the live Q&A session every Friday at noon, so please tune into that if you have any questions. Please don't email me with complicated metabolic questions. It's much easier to just answer it during our normally scheduled class, which is Fridays at 12. And I'd be happy to pull up whatever slide confuses you and answer all the questions at that point. The lectures will also be a little bit shorter. I usually budget in like 15 to 20 minutes for discussion and questions. So, most of these lectures are going to run for about an hour or so, or a little less than that. So I apologize for that. But again, usually, these are kind of designed to teach in person. Anyway, have a great rest of your day.